Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams, and we're back with a small print. And today, my guest is again Heidi Swart, who we invited back to talk about some new developments when it comes to surveillance and privacy and your rights as citizens going forward. But as always on the show, Heidi, we like our guests to introduce themselves the way they'd like to be introduced. So over to you. Who are you? What do you do? And where are you in the world?
Hi, Bronwyn. Thanks for having me. So I'm an investigative journalist, and I've been focusing on surveillance, intelligence, and cyber issues for about 10 years now. And at the moment, I am also the research and journalism coordinator for an organization called Intelwatch. And it's basically, as the name suggests, a watchdog organization trying to hold to account the state and private intelligence services. So that would be the bodies like the State Security Agency, for example. And we operate in South Africa, but we will also be looking at the rest of Africa and, in fact, the world. That is our plan.
Okay, well, tell us a bit more about the organization. It's yourself, and who else is involved, or are they all anonymous, as these things can often be, particularly within these sorts of industries? And where can people find out more about that organization? So I'd like to get that out the way before we get into the meat of today's content.
So you can visit our website at intelwatch.org.za. And on our board, we have Jane Duncan, who was with Johannesburg University's journalism department, who's been running the project that preceded Intelwatch for many years. It was called the Media Policy and Democracy Project. And we, as part of that project, there were journalism and research projects running all over Africa. And all that we are hoping to amalgamate it now into this more formal organization. And my director is Murray Hunter, who has been with Right to Know as well as Alt Advisory. So yeah, it's the surveillance crowd that we're all there.
Okay, so tell us a bit about the projects that you're currently watching in your professional and as a capacity as an independent journalist, and obviously now with Intelwatch. What are some of the developments with regards to our security landscape in South Africa and across the continent and even across the world that you currently have your eye on that are of interest and maybe should be of concern for listeners?
Well, there are many. I'm not sure where to start. So let's start with South Africa. Our primary concern at the moment is the new General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill, or GLAB. We were hoping that GLAB would, fix all the issues that emerged during the Zondo Commission. Specifically the Zondo Commission inquiry into the State Security Agency, and that included theft of secret state funds. It included factionalization and politicalization of the agency, etc. So we were hoping that this would fix it, but it hasn't quite. It hasn't really changed the laws in a way to prevent, a second capture of the organization, of the State Security Agency, I mean. And so we have some shocking inclusions in this bill as well that I think have blindsided civil society, particularly a vetting requirement, which basically will give the State Security Agency sort of, blanket powers to decide what nonprofit organizations or churches it's going to vet. So, and security vetting is normally a tool where you dig into the person's background to make sure they don't have debts, or they haven't had, a number of affairs. They're not, they're a trustworthy person, so that you can trust them with state secrets and sensitive information. So, for example, let's say you are a member of the State Security Agency, or you work at Crime Intelligence or the Financial Intelligence Center. Those are all positions for which you will have to be vetted, right? So that's what vetting is. So now they want to do this with nonprofit organizations. And the reason for that is that they are afraid that certain nonprofits might be involved in money laundering and terror financing. But the law is very broad. So as the way it stands now, they will basically be able to decide that they will vet anyone who they deem as a security threat. And of course, the definition of security threat is also very broad. One can go into the details, but the way it's defined at the moment, it's basically whatever they decide it is. If the minister decides, or if the agency decides, okay, this is a threat, we're going to investigate it. And everything, of course, happens in secret. So if they decide something is a threat, they're going to secretly investigate it, and there will be very little to no consequences if there are illegalities. Well, that has been our experience in the past, and we are expecting that to continue in the future. So that's our major worry at the moment in South Africa. Apart from the fact that we still have our secret funding mechanism that also emerged in the Zondo Commission. I mean, it's a massive black budget that it doesn't get audited. People can do whatever the hell they want to do with it. This type of budget is common to intelligence services all around the world. And of course, it's problematic if you don't have robust internal systems, making sure that the money isn't being squandered. I mean, a lot of state capture in the end, a lot of the money that went missing during state capture came from the secret funding. So that's an issue for us. The other big South African issue is RICA, the interception laws in South Africa. These are the ones used by the police mostly when they want to sort of draw on suspects' phone records, or they want to tap a suspect's phone, etc., see what your emails are doing. We just had a law that was supposed to overhaul that because there were big issues with it. So, for instance, in most democracies, if you are surveilled, there is such a thing as post-surveillance notification. And here we didn't have that. So that's the type of thing that's being introduced now. But there are still many shortcomings with that bill. And then in the broader sense, if you look at Africa and even the rest of the world, these issues are pervasive. And we're talking about, so in the UK, there was this new online safety bill where they were hoping to scan, I think they've backed off from it a bit now, but where they wanted to scan encrypted conversations. In the United States, as far as I know, they still have not really figured out how to ensure, constitutional use of mass surveillance. And then obviously there's you can't, I mean, countries like China, etc., where everything is completely legal, where you have no privacy. So it's a mix. And what happens is in Africa, these things collide. We have many regimes in Africa with weak laws, and we have vendors that are itching to sell surveillance technology, be it communication surveillance technology, spyware, cameras, street cameras, etc. So we have these weak laws, and we have eager vendors, and we have politicians who really want to keep an eye on their constituents. That seems to be a sort of a general theme among leaders, is that they want more information and that they don't really care how they get it. So these are sort of the universal themes that keep cropping up. Another major thing is biometrics, facial recognition. The world is becoming such that you basically will not really be able to go anywhere without having your face scanned. I mean, it's replacing the fingerprint. So, and we know that's it's a bit frightening because, whereas your fingerprint, you still have to sort of, put it down on a scanner. As technology improves, one's face is, and if you can walk into a door or through a doorway and there's a camera overhead roughly the same height, they can scan your face and they know you've entered. You don't have to, comply with anything. So biometrics, particularly at voting stations, at ports entering and exiting the country, but also just the general use of biometrics, even at estates and so forth, that's proliferating at an alarming rate. And we don't know how secure the data is. We don't know what the data is being used for, etc. So as you can see, it's quite a broad spectrum. And I'm not even going to start on cybersecurity and cyber espionage and cyber warfare, because that's a whole different kettle of fish. But yeah, these are the kind of things that we look at.
Okay, so maybe we can just we can play nice, and we can say what are some of the reasons why states, and it seems to be a global trend, are all kind of coordinating, if you even want to use such a word, around these sorts of bills at the moment, bills that give states more rights to intercept communications, to surveil first and then ask for sort of forgiveness later, or not at all, and to collect that sort of information on their populace. What are the reasons why policymakers are pushing these these sorts of proposals, at least nominally? How are they persuading people that need to be persuaded that these policies need to be processed and published and put into action, that they are for the greater good, if you want to put it that way?
Look, so I think there are two sides to it, perhaps. The one thing is vendor push. The folks that sell these technologies, they're quite relentless. If you take something like public space surveillance, these camera systems that they sell, for instance, there's a widespread belief that if you install these cameras, that's going to solve your crime problem, and that's a myth that vendors really push, and people seem to buy into it. If you look at some, it feels intuitively true. Yeah, no one's going to commit a crime if there's a camera watching them. Is it true? Well, no. But I mean, that's a whole other story. So there are these sort of myths that vendors sell. I mean, if you look at the UK now with this online bill, it seems to make sense intuitively. There's nothing worse than child exploitation. I mean, that's pretty much top on everybody's agenda. That's something you want to stop. So, and that's a very compelling reason to say, well, and here's the other argument: you're not doing anything wrong, so you shouldn't mind being surveilled. It's only, those who are engaging in child exploitation who need to be worried. So why do you want to put brakes on our abilities and our efforts to protect children? So that's how the argument gets turned around. If you're not for surveillance, it means you're not for public safety, and therefore you are a bad person. So there's the argument that privacy is ideological. In other words, safety is not. Safety is concrete. Safety is something that everybody should want. It's a natural, it's a if you look at the hierarchy of needs, it's so basic. You should want to be safe. So what's wrong with you that you want privacy? But the fault with that argument is, and again, people who are pushing surveillance, be it government, being it vendors, is that you need privacy to be safe. I mean, and that's pretty basic. If you're online, you need privacy to be safe. In your home, you need to lock the doors if you want to be safe, unfortunately, in our society. So if people can see what you're doing, that exposes you to crime. So that is the flip side of it. And there are also other aspects, such as, do you want to live in a society where you have to censor yourself because people can see what you're saying and doing? We have no freedom of thought, because that itself is a form of severe oppression. So that side of the coin gets ignored by people who really are pushing surveillance. Governments, on the other hand, apart from big money to be made, okay, by the vendors, and they're pushing these sort of these myths. Governments, I think, historically, and you can see this. I mean, you can see this going all the way back to George Washington, who was, America's first president, using intelligence during the Wars of Independence. You can see it in Tsarist Russia. They had their spies and watching the population. So intelligence has always been of use to, and I was going to say, crucial to country leaders. And it's also sort of a rule of thumb that if there is a technology that they can use to protect their power, then they will protect it. And they will use it, to protect that power. So it's sort of it's these two long-standing principles that one can always count on, that politicians want to know what is threatening their power, not necessarily their people, but their power. Of course, if it's a threat to their people, that could threaten their power. You can get voted out if you are not seen to be caring about the public. Anyway, so, and if safety goes wrong, let's say there's a bombing or a terror attack, that's a very obvious, that's very well publicized, and everyone can see, okay, you've slipped up. So yes, in that sense, perhaps it is because they care about their societies, but I also definitely think, and particularly in authoritarian regimes, there is obviously a move to suppress behavior, and you don't want too much questioning. But on the other hand, in democratic regimes, you have a place like London where that's probably the most surveilled city in the world. And I think, again, the British have a history of being obsessed with intelligence and secrecy. So that doesn't really surprise me. It's a mentality that's been developing for generations. And the idea is always that you need to know more than the other person. You need to know more than the public. And the public, well, the public doesn't really need to know because they don't know what's good for them. So it's an attitude that politicians have. I don't know if they think about this attitude or if they even question their own beliefs. But really, it's a global trend, and it's a historic trend, and it's I almost want to say I think it's ingrained in politicians, no matter what their orientation, be it democratic, authoritarian, socialist, etc.
Are there any governments that are not pro increasing surveillance, which seems to be in a sort of just continuous basis? It seems to be that's the trend. That's how we're tending towards less and less privacy, much and much more space being under the watchful gaze of the public sector, either by your neighbors, even if it's through private sector, sort of installed your self-surveillance devices like Amazon Rings, likes all the rumor tells here in South Africa, which is again completely voluntary. It's a peer-to-peer surveillance networks that we see popping up. Are there any parts of the world where we're seeing people have resisted this at a societal level? Because as much as we can talk about Europe actually engaging in a lot of this sort of surveillance, at least nominally, and across a lot of their parliamentary debates, they talk about rights to privacy, they talk about right to be forgotten, they talk about all these things. There seems to be an understanding, at least in some parts of the world, that on the values of privacy and on the values of private, not just public consumption information. I mean, even the data rights conversation taps into this. Or is it just a grand irony that it's wrong when it's being done and to sort of serve you with dark ads or effective advertising based on your personality or your emotions and your browsing history? That's very naughty. And of course, people should have privacy when they're browsing online, but under the gaze of the capitalist sort of big brother network. But that conversation necessarily translate back through to the state space. But are there any parts of the world where privacy as a human right is being discussed as an actual natural human rights? Not that I'm not entirely convinced that natural rights do exist. They're all social constructs, but yeah, nonetheless, is it still
no, I get your gist. Yeah, are there countries that don't think this is a good idea? None that I know of, to be honest.
They'll do it if they can.
Yeah, none that, I mean, look, I have not looked at every single country in the world, so I might be missing something. But certainly the countries that I've looked at across every continent, it is an issue. And it is an issue in, there's a pro-surveillance movement even in developing countries. So, or even in countries with less to spend. Look, I think the reason why the conversation in Europe is sort of only starting now, after all the technology has already been rolled out, is because it's that old story of the tech rolls out too quickly for it to be for the law to keep up with it. It just rolls out very quickly. So I mean, in South Africa we have the VumaCam networks. For people that don't know about it, that's a private security IP camera network, and it's taken over most of Joburg, I think, by now. Used by security companies. The way I understand it, it's mostly sort of security companies that drive the installation of it, and they offer it as part of their package to neighborhoods, etc. There's a widespread support for it. So that network, I mean, they launched in February 2019, and they'd been going for quite a while before our Protection of Information Act kicked in. I'm not exactly sure, when did Papaya become really,
it was like coming 20 years, but the actual
but it only kicked in, I think, last year or something like that. But anyway, so I have to go check the date. But the point is, VumaCam has been carrying on for quite a while, and our information regulator has only really sort of set up shop now. And only now are there going to be inquiries into VumaCam's system. So everything comes later. And people always say, oh, the law is so slow to catch up to the tech. But the fact is that that is how it works. We don't know what to legislate until it exists. You know, people try things and then we see, okay, wait a minute. This is having effects that we did not foresee. And then we have to develop the law. So that for me is not necessarily surprising. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is not great that it is taking so long. That I think the bureaucratic slow, mechanisms that slow it down, I think that really is something we can work on. In terms of countries in the world that aren't embracing this, none that I know of. And like I said, even countries that don't really have the budget, or shouldn't really have the budget for it, or should be spending their money on something else, are really buying into this. I mean, a good example, for example, is the proliferation of border management agencies in Africa, right? So the idea is that you secure your borders. There are biometrics there. You have special border guards, and you pass through with it's sort of an intergovernment. It's sort of a government agency on its own, but it liaises with other, it'll liaise with defense and it'll liaise with police, etc. It'll liaise with state security. And the idea is obviously to track goods and to track people. And often, sort of shockingly, one of the motivations used for it is, we don't want illegal immigrants, okay? Which is terrible if you think of Africa, where you have major, there's so many refugee crises and so many people fleeing countries in war-torn areas. So the point is they're setting up these biometric systems that really record who goes where, and are making it increasingly difficult for people and goods to move. And on the one hand, yes, it is important, as opposed to from a safety perspective, we don't want smuggling, we don't want people, criminals fleeing to countries, etc. But the point is, those things will happen anyway, because what gets smuggled either doesn't get smuggled through the border post, or there is corruption. And it doesn't really matter how good your technology is. If your officials are not, are not on the straight and narrow, that's not going to help you. But again, many of those technologies are being pushed by major vendors from Europe. We have two big vendors, I think, in Africa. Well, we have many, but two major ones is France's IDEMIA, and we also have NEC Japan. In Africa, it's NEC Exxon. So those are very good, for example, facial recognition technologies. And those types of companies are the ones that can gain from the African market. Ironically, if you look at Africa and the way that they are starting to digitalize their identities, you have to have a facial scan and a fingerprint to actually get an identity card, and then to be able to access social services. So the irony is, we all want colonialism to finish. We all wish that could just, we could just get that out of the way. But what's happening with these kinds of systems is that Africans are becoming dependent on Europe and other more developed countries for their own identities. And without it, you can't move. And once you are registered, on a country's biometric system, the future of that is quite dystopian, because from there onwards, you move to cameras that you have in the street that can scan your face and recognize you. More and more fingerprint usages at banks, at shops, to open your phone, etc., etc. So more and more data points. And it used to be that we lived, at least you could put your phone off, you could leave it at home. But the way things are moving, even in countries that, really should be spending their money on something else, is on these sort of omnipotent, is that the right word? On these all-encompassing systems that not only, know where you are as far as your phone is concerned, but also when you're out in the street and you have no technology with you. So to answer your question, No, I don't know of any country where that stuff is not happening. I'm not really aware of it, where the government and the private sector and everybody has said, no, we're not doing this. This is bad. Because everybody stands to gain big contracts and a lot of power. In fact, yes, I mean, I really do believe that people are spending money on these systems when they could be spending money on something else.
That all makes sense. However, like the other point is, who actually cares? Like you've articulated some of the reasons why people should care, but who actually cares at the moment? So if pretty much all governments across the world are aligned in the idea that this is generally a good idea in terms of governance and in terms of upholding their end of the social contract to provide safety, security, and now surveillance for their citizens, there's pushback there. As I've said, like there does seem to be a pushback from governments towards corporate surveillance, unless it's the government using the corporate surveillance in order to participate in that process, right? So you see lots of op-eds about the evils of capitalists, tracking you and tracing you, but you don't see op-eds about the downsides of government surveillance. In fact, you read lots of op-eds, from the intellectual, literati around the world, but how these are good things and how we should be embracing more surveillance for fairness purposes, to make sure everyone does their part, like enforcing, like during COVID times, if nobody wants to remain locked down voluntarily, everybody only wants to do it if everyone else was doing it too, right? What's the point of me being a good citizen unless everyone else is too? I don't see any arguments really, other than from bodies like yourself and maybe like Big Brother Watch in the UK and my more sort of the stranger friends on the weirder corners of the internet who get accused of being conspiracy theorists 9 days out of every 10 on social media. If they pipe up against any of this stuff, there does seem to be, there's like podcasts put out by the BBC talking about how people that have concerns around financial surveillance or facial recognition are crazy conspiracy theorists who should really just sit back down and take off their tinfoil hats, right? There's who actually does care? Or is it only crazy people that care? Crazy people like, I have to put you and probably myself into that group too. Does anybody care? Or is privacy just not something that people even care about on the ground? Governments clearly don't. Corporations are clearly very happy to participate for lots of money. Citizens, most people don't seem to think this is a big issue. And there have been some very interesting sort of surveys that have come out, particularly with younger generations, who have no problem with even the government installing cameras within their own homes to make sure their parents are behaving and not engaging in hate speech, to keep everybody safe and happy all the time. So who cares? And do you have an answer for that? Or is it sadly no one?
No, you know what the problem is? We are a small group of organizations and people who understand the dangers and who are trying to sort of warn people and say, look, no, this is actually not good. But if you look at the money behind surveillance, we can't compete with those budgets. We can't compete with those messages. It's just the advertising for surveillance, literally the advertising for surveillance, because in the end, I mean, all these op-eds that are sort of, or analyses that are sort of pro-surveillance, that for me all of that kind of counts as advertisement, and we cannot compete with it. So that's the one thing. So it's a sort of a Herculean task, and there's no telling where it will end. There's no telling if we will be successful, if we will eventually be able to scale back on this stuff. People generally, and it boils down to the thing that, how tangible is privacy? It doesn't become tangible to you until you get hacked, for example. It's not going to become tangible to you until some syndicate hacks into your IP-based camera network and starts following all your movements and knows exactly when to break into your house. You might even really know that they hacked into your IP network. So that is the one thing. It's not a tangible thing. People worry about money. They worry about again, safety. They worry about shelter. They worry about what they're going to eat. Privacy and lack of surveillance is not one of the things they worry about. And in particular, in countries where people are suffering and struggling, and where there really isn't time to worry about anything that other than your basic needs and your survival. So it's very, very difficult to really take this sort of abstract concept and get people to understand that this can actually translate into some real tangible danger. And it's a very, very long campaign, I think, that is ahead of us. And I think people will have to start having bad experiences with surveillance repeatedly, up to a point where it becomes sort of mainstream knowledge that, okay, it isn't all good. But again, there's that, as you say, there's the whole conspiracy theorist label, tinfoil hat thing. The problem with intelligence and surveillance is it often does fall into that category.
Yeah.
It took me a very long time when I first started in this field what was it? The first stories I wrote was in 2010. 2011. And it was the first story I ever wrote was about a guy from crime intelligence who had a partner in crime intelligence. He'd retired, they'd gotten divorced, and he basically alleged that she was terrorizing him from within, drawing his bank statements, drawing his looking into his text messages, trying to basically extort money from him, etc. So even then it was difficult for me to believe, and we ran the story because the guy was willing to go on record and have his face in the paper. If he hadn't done that, I don't know if we would have run the story. So by now things are better. You can now at least run such a story, and people will believe you because they've become aware that this stuff is real. But even back then, I had a very difficult time believing all of this. I thought, this guy, it's Fruit Loop. This can't be real. It can't be. And then you get into the domain of mass surveillance, and then you think, that can't be real either. How is that even possible? And we've had big stories, for example, on mass telephone surveillance. I mean, there was a story about Echelon that broke in the 90s that sparked an entire review from the European Commission. But that's sort of been relegated to the realm of myth again. Sort of now, I heard about Echelon, a couple of years ago, and I thought, that doesn't sound real. And that doesn't sound real, but it was real. There was a book about it. There was an inquiry into it. It happened. So there's a tendency for these things to just be, and then Edward Snowden happened. It was like, for the first time, everyone realizes mass surveillance is going on. And you're like, no, but this is the third time already that this kind of thing has come on. The first big issue was during Watergate. So people forget, generations forget what has happened. And every time it's like a new big shock. And every time it seems surreal. And I think that is because I think it's also about that basic human, thing of, that can't happen to me. There's no way that can happen to me. There's no way someone is sitting somewhere in a dark room and, with a computer screen and reading my emails. And again, it's sort of been turned into fiction, and it has literally been turned into fiction. There's so many shows, spy shows, cop shows, and there's a tendency for those forms of entertainment to be turned into just that, entertainment. And the spies and the cops are the good guys. So, it's usually very often portrayed in the light of, you can trust the police. You can trust those involved in espionage. You can trust the government. They're trying to do this for the greater good. So that is also part of the message coming out against persons or organizations such as ours, where we're trying to say, look, whoa, this is not necessarily a good thing. So, yeah, to answer your question again, there's so much pro surveillance messaging out there, direct messages, but also sort of more subtle things. Well, if you can call it subtle, like entertainment shows, it becomes very difficult, I think, for people to really understand why we shouldn't want to do this. It's just, I don't want to call it propaganda, because it's not quite there. Some of it is, but the messaging is just too strong.
Yeah, so it almost like gets into the realm of the unbelievable. Like I remember like when I started out in the sort of future space, looking at future of governance, and we'd come back with the case studies of the first cases of China automatically finding jaywalkers as they walked across the street, to the point that we even had some people who were celebrities that had their faces on like painted on buses, you know, like as part of advertising campaigns, who were also automatically being fined every day for jaywalking in the street because their face was on a bus and it was getting caught by these things. And these sound very silly and very fantastical. It can only happen in China. And then like last month, we have protests now suddenly taking place in the UK, where people are physically destroying surveillance cameras that are automatically recognizing, identifying, and finding people for driving in places where they are not welcome to drive, where only official residents are welcome to drive. This is, of course, all the traffic control zoning sort of things, right? So the actual residents of Oxford can drive, you know, around freely, but now because we've got things like facial recognition, vehicle recognition, automatically process things, non-residents, which generally tend to be the poorer people who can't afford to live in the center of town, that have to commute every day, are now being fined daily very huge amounts of money in terms of like a working class person's sort of daily income for going places where they're physically not welcome to be. And then they start becoming class issues. It starts becoming not a surveillance issue, but a financial issue. But that's the whole point. It's everything that you're saying, that once it can be done, sooner or later it's going to be done. So it's one thing for like the UK to put up surveillance cameras everywhere under the sort of nominal guise of monitoring crime and being able to catch criminals. It's quite different when you start to be branded a criminal for engaging in behavior that was completely normal yesterday, right?
Yes,
But still, you know, the good, noble, wealthy journalistic class who gets to live in the privileged areas and is not getting fined on a daily basis because they've happened to be sort of by dint of birth born into the right country and the right community at the right time. They're on the right side of facial surveillance. When they cross the border, they're welcomed home because their face is the right. You know, so having the right face gives them a sense of, why should anyone care about this? Because it works perfectly well for me, because my face is a good face. And I think it's so close to issues of racism. And I think in South Africa, we should be so careful with this. I mean, we know our history. We know how passbooks worked. We know how the old government would have instituted these technologies and capabilities to oppress. And we know it can be done. You know, humans do this. People are not all altruistic all of the time. And we know that you can end up just by luck of the draw on the wrong side of the genetic lottery, the wrong face in the wrong place at the wrong time, can suddenly you cut off physically and physically from all sorts of accesses to good services and opportunities. And as our sort of identities become blurred between our physical identity and our digital identity, people talk about it being fragmented, but it's actually the other way around. They're actually all being combined. And people talk about self-sovereign identity and this ability to sort of just pull out whatever badge or credential any given time. But as soon as it gets digitized, it is connected, because everything digital is connected. No, there's no forgetting the digital world. So we're not fragmenting our identities. We're consolidating them to a place where we are removing any opportunities for anonymity. Which, as I said again, fine if you have the right face in the right place at the right time. It's not fine if you have the wrong face. And again, we tend to think about physical borders, putting up literal walls, like the whole Trump sort of era in America. Like, he was such a bad guy. How dare he put up a border physically to keep people out, you know? And like, and of course that's right, because that criticism is right. Not building the wall is right, because all of our borders and boundaries are human constructs. They're all artificial. None of them make any sense, especially in Africa. None of our borders make sense, you know, but and yet we think that we're on the right side of a history for enforcing them. But now we can do this with sort of invisible borders. So I was reading up before this interview as to what's happening now in the US-Mexican border. So, of course, Trump's physical wall was condemned and has been like left to rot and not to be built up. But the current administration in the US has replaced it with an invisible border, in that they fitting now illegal immigrants with ankle monitors, the same way you would fit prisoners with ankle monitors, you know, right? So much like a dog collar that sort of barks when you go into the wrong place, the wrong time. We're doing this to people now, but it's invisible, right? So again, it allows you to sort of wash your hands, very Pontius Pilate-like, and say, but it won't affect good people who stay where they're supposed to be and don't go where they're not supposed to go. But what's stopping you from being the wrong person? You know, what's stopping the rules from changing, and suddenly you finding yourself on kind of the wrong side of history. Also, what the US is doing, which is again something you'd think that people would speak out a bit against, that these lines are being crossed. Part of that sort of migrant control there, that they're invisible borders that they're now putting up instead of a physical wall to separate people. And it's not getting the same criticism the physical wall got, is they've got these selfie check-in programs where at a defined time of the day, if you're a sort of a migrant under surveillance by the administration, because you're not really supposed to be there, you have to check in with your selfie that's geotagged to your location at a defined point of time every day, which is incredible. And yet we don't complain about it. In fact, that still predates, or it comes after what happened in Australia during COVID, where that's also how they enforced their lockdowns. They would wake people up at 2 a.m. in the morning, people under quarantine, and make them check into the government with a geolocated selfie at a given time. And that's shocking to someone that's sort of grown up listening to sort of dystopian literature and watching dystopian movies. But nobody complained about it. In fact, almost everyone I spoke to in my privileged, intellectual, well-paid Zoom class across the world actually said that was quite fair. And it was good for the government to be doing that, to be waking people up at 2 a.m. to check in with a facial recognition selfie and geotag where you are. People were not shocked about it, which I find shocking. Anyway, I think I'm sort of losing the train of thought here. We talk about these things, the more insane you feel, because nobody sees what you see. And I don't have the answers as to why people are not disturbed by this, why so much of society is not only complacent with it, but actually quite supportive of invisible oppression, as long as it's not physical oppression, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's the same effect. It's the wrong faces in the wrong places that are denied credit or denied the ability to access good services and opportunity that's now being automated in such a way that we can kind of pretend that everyone is free and fair and equal, even though everyone is not, because that oppression becomes digitized and becomes invisible to the bystander or to the people who are the right people in the right places.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you're saying is exactly right. We have our social issues. I mean, racism is a massive issue. There's no reason to think that if we have a new technology with which to enforce the law, which has traditionally been angled against Black people. I mean, let's just face it, especially in America, it's just
the wrong color people of the wrong race.
Yeah, I mean, and with our history as well, there's absolutely no reason to think that technology will benefit these people that are already being oppressed. Technology will make our, crime prevention or our crime fighting, whatever you want to call it, better, which means that since oppression is built into that crime prevention and crime fighting, is going to exacerbate that oppression. And it's then no surprise that you have facial recognition that cannot discern two Black faces from each other. There's no surprise in that. And it's also no surprise that you end up having white police officers or white security forces saying, well, this looks like a match. It's not really cause for a warrant, but we're going to go arrest the guy. That's also, I mean, that is, and that's typically what happens. So you have the system that basically strengthens the hand of the oppressing side. I mean, in this issue with the cameras in London, and what you said there, it was legal yesterday, but today it's not. That is a very crucial point that people need to understand when they tout the argument that, well, you're not doing anything wrong, so why are you worried? And that's the thing. We make the rules today, we set up the system to enforce the rules. But now we have the system to enforce whatever rules we want to. Tomorrow, we change the rules. So yesterday, you were fine under these rules with this system of surveillance, but tomorrow you might not be. And what happened there in London is a great example of it. And what people don't understand is one also has to think, what sort of a place do you want to live in one day? What sort of a country do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a country where people cannot control themselves, where people do not have integrity, where you are so cynical that you don't think people will stay in line or do what is good for society unless you keep an eye on them? Is that the kind of world in principle that you want to live in? And I don't think people think that far. I don't think people have time to think that far. I mean, to understand these things, to really understand them, you really have to spend some time doing it. And again, it's that messaging. The messaging to really tell people the dangers, it simply isn't strong enough. It just isn't strong enough. And again, as you say, if you're on the right side of the technology, if you're on the right, if you're on the, if you are in the privileged group, why would you even bother with such messaging? Most people, also for this, you need to be able to empathize and to look outside of yourself. There are a ton of people who never even watch the news, who don't read. And I'm not talking about people who aren't educated or didn't go to school. I'm talking about educated people with degrees. And very few people know anything about this topic that we're talking about now. For us, it's sort of everyday, well, because we engage with these things, but the majority of people are pretty clueless. They are just, they're just clueless. So, it comes back to that old thing, is it's a marketing problem. We don't have the same resources that government and vendors do.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a very difficult, it's a difficult proposition, but you've got yourself into this place now. You are now involved in an organization who's making it your mission to do what? What is the purpose of your organization? Is it to educate the public, or is it to push back using legal and policy means? What are you doing to address this gap that we see now in terms of power and privilege around surveillance?
Yeah, so that what you just said is basically what we do. We are pushing for more research in the field. We are, not only, research reports, but also journalism articles that are accessible to people, that people can read, that people can understand, that it can really lay out to people how the technology works and what the effect of it is. And I don't mean that how the technology works in terms of, deep technical details, but more in terms of what it's used for, what its capabilities are, and what it can do for you, what it can do for government, and what it can, assist them to do to you. So those are the sort of, that's the information that I'm trying to get out there in my role at the organization. But we are also engaging in advocacy. So, for example, the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill that I spoke to earlier, we are trying to get as many civil society organizations to sign our endorsement statement, to endorse our joint statement on why we need to, stop this bill, stop these provisions from passing through, especially vetting nonprofit organizations, but also, not controlling the funds that intelligence services have access to, not having any real transparency there. Another big thing, for example, that's missing in GLAB is there's such a thing as the National Communications Center, which is our mass communications surveillance center. In other words, they tap the cables, the fiber optic cables that land on the continent. So they have now been, in terms of GLAB, they've now been given legal status. It is now for the first time the National Communications Center is, in law, and it can operate. And there are really very few safeguards. There's one judge that is going to look at applications to use the technology to spy on people. That judge is appointed by the president. Oh. So if I recall correctly, and then there are going to be some mass interception experts that assist the judge. And those experts are going to be approved by the minister. So these are the types of these are the types of problems that are being introduced with the new law. We're lobbying as many nonprofits as we can to stand against it, because it really will facilitate it. I mean, the SSA was so useful in facilitating state capture, and this just sets it up, to just be that body be that facilitator once more. I mean, we're also looking, for example, we're doing a joint campaign or a joint effort with the Right to Know campaign. We're asking the public protector, the information regulator, to look into VUMA-CAM systems to see if they compliant with the Protection of Information Act. So there's that happening. Furthermore, we're just looking into expanding our research into the rest of the continent, and from there on, we will launch our future campaigns. We, of course, we ourselves at the moment don't have the capacity to litigate, but we try to assist. So, for example, in any sort of court case that might come up, we will if it's suitable, we can be act as a friend to the court, etc. So yeah, that's basically the gist of what we're doing. We're trying to get knowledge out there, but we're also trying to influence laws.
And do you think, how optimistic are you of your ability to do both of those things, to educate people, but to educate them in not just the way they are talked to or taught at, but in a way that they actually understand what you're trying to say, firstly, which is based on the conversation today, quite an uphill battle. And secondly, how optimistic are you that these bills that are proposed, that are being pushed through at the moment, can and will be challenged in court? I know that we do have quite actually a long successful history in civil society in South Africa with resisting laws using, or bad laws, bad policy, even corruption via the very slow-moving legal channels. But there are reasons to be hopeful those mechanisms can change things. But in this case, how optimistic are you that these bills can and will be amended?
Look, I mean, there was a couple of years ago, you'll recall, there was the Protection of State Information Bill. That, by the way, is still floating around. People are still fighting that thing. But it hasn't seen the light of day. Even in Zuma's, former President Zuma's tenure, it didn't happen. And I think that was largely due to public pushback. I also think that if we are getting quite a lot of support on this matter, so I think we have a real chance of stopping that bill from becoming reality. I'm not a legal expert, but I do think, based on what experts like Pierre de Vos has written, that we will be able to challenge this eventually. If it goes as far as as, for example, the Constitutional Court, whether we will be the ones, our organization will be the ones to challenge it. We don't know who's going to do that, but it will be possible. So I'm quite hopeful in terms of the broader picture. Look, ultimately, people can choose things. People can fight for things, and people can make choices. You can choose, for example, to use DuckDuckGo as a browser or Tor as a browser instead of Google Chrome. You can choose to use Signal instead of sending an SMS, or instead of using Telegram or WhatsApp or etc. So, you can choose to stop using your Facebook. You can choose these things, or, at least for your personal stuff, you can make a lot of changes on your own. And I do believe that we just need time. That's what we need. We need time, and we need consistency. So if we can keep on sending the same message out over time, and we can just keep it going and broaden it, and there's no reason why we can't broaden it, because the bottom line is, for the majority of reasonable people, I think, and I mean, this is my own speculation, but the people that I speak to about this stuff that know nothing about it, once I start explaining it to them, they are usually like, oh my God, that's really bad. So I think with the proper tools, with some tenacity, and with consistency, you can get the right message out there, and you just have to keep going. That's what it boils down to. Because if you don't keep going, then you know exactly what will happen. So yeah, I do believe that there is only one way forward, and that is to scale down on these things. And it can happen. It can happen, and I believe it will happen.
Well, that's the most positive note we can get to in this conversation to end things on. Thank you so much, Heidi. And if people want to find you, find out more about your work personally and through the organizations that you're working with, here's the opportunity to share what you want to share, what you're not afraid to put out into the public domain as to where people can get hold of you if they want to support any of your work or to interview you further about these topics or anything like that.
Yeah, sure. So you can reach me at research, it's the word research, at intelwatch.org. So Intelwatch is INTEL and then the word watch.org.za. Sorry, .org.za. So that's it. Yeah, research at intelwatch.org.za. And yeah, if you have any suggestions or tips, then hit me up.
Definitely. We're going to have to do another one of these conversations looking at private sector surveillance in South Africa in particular with regards to some of the more Leviathan-like organizations that are being built out and around, nominally for our own self-reinforcing good. But otherwise, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you again. And good luck with your endeavors. It's definitely worthy work that you're engaged with.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.